I want to talk for a few minutes about what's going on in Texas and why I think that sort of thing is going to become more common going forward. So I'm going to try to be succinct here. I know I'm inclined to bloviate and go off on tangents. So I actually made notes, sort of. But anyways, I'm seeing in the news a lot of apologies for the wind farms, wind turbines, and their failures. And just from a statistical standpoint, 23% of Texas's power is wind generated, and roughly half their turbines failed. So that was a big deal. There's no way to get around that. Just by the numbers, that was a big deal. That was a big part of what happened, what is happening. But it's not the only part either. Natural gas was also a big deal. And the natural gas failures, from what I read, they seem to be related mostly to the fact that their infrastructure isn't winterized because they don't typically have sub-zero temperatures in Texas, particularly for prolonged periods. That's not a normal part of their climate if you consider 1961 to 1990 averages to be normal. But that's not the whole story either. There's also failures of planning. There was a lot of failures. But this sort of thing is going to become more common because of policy. Government policy, and I'm going to give you New York for example. We are to have 100% renewable energy by the year 2030 in New York State. That is absurdly ambitious. And specifically, that means wind, solar, and geothermal. And since geothermal isn't really happening, we're not seeing any geothermal plants being built on any sort of scale, and nor are we likely to in the near future. It basically, for all intents and purposes, means we're going to wind and solar. And hydro could theoretically be included, but we're not going to build new dams and new reservoirs and flood out thousands of acres of land because, well, there'd be too much pushback from the people on that. So that's not going to happen. Hydro is actually very reliable, but it's also not very environmentally friendly when you consider the amount of land you're flooding, and it's very expensive to buy the rights to all that land. And there's usually a pretty big political toll to pay for doing that sort of thing. So don't expect to see any hydro on any sort of scale going forward. We're looking at wind, we're looking at solar. This is problematic, right? Now, it's pretty doubtful that this agenda will be realized. It's 9 years away. I mean, it's just doesn't seem possible that we can actually make it happen in that time frame. But that's not the point. The point is that's what we're going to move forward towards. That's what we are doing. That's what we are implementing now. So you see these solar farms going up all over the place. They're mostly small ones, but there are some bigger ones in the works. You see a lot of wind turbines going up. And when we look at what is likely to happen in the future, we're going to see situations like they have in Texas for some very good reasons. Now, wind turbines freeze up sometimes during ice storms. It's really not the big thing that concerns me. What concerns me with wind turbines is that during periods of extreme high pressure and extreme cold, like you sometimes get during the winter time for a while. I mean, these things can last a couple of weeks or more. A lot of times you don't have a lot of wind, so the wind turbines are going to be producing very little power right at the time when demand is the highest for heat. And solar panels are obviously very problematic because they don't produce electricity at night. I mean, if you want to get technical, maybe a very tiny amount from moonshine, but for all intents and purposes, they aren't producing at night. And solar panels aren't producing when they're covered with snow. And it's a big deal because it snows a lot in the north. and particularly in the Northeast. And so there's some small solar farms near me that have gone up recently, and I drive by them all the time, and they're frequently covered in snow. All the solar panels. Usually it takes a day or two for the snow to slide off them, but you know, if you get a big storm, they get covered. They're going to be covered for a day or two, a couple days, few days if you have continuous storms. I have actually some solar panels in my yard. The snow just slid off them today, and they've been snow covered for at least 3 weeks now. You know, I haven't gone out and cleaned them because I'm not really using them, but it's easy to see that during hard winter weather, right when the demand is the highest, when the heat is most critical, when you have to have a reliable grid that's not going to fail, it is going to fail as we move more and more and more towards renewable energy. And I'm not against renewable energy. I'm actually for renewable energy. I'm for lowering our carbon footprint. I'm for reducing emissions. I'm absolutely for curtailing pollution. I'm against pollution. But I don't think we're being logical, rational, or reasonable. And we're talking about revamping society at a scale we've never done in this sort of time frame. And I just look at these plans, and I got to believe nobody's ever even crunched the numbers. I mean, it's unthinkable that you're talking about changing the entire energy industry, and did you even crunch the numbers? I don't, and you know, I can't believe that anyone did, because these plans, my daughter's starting to cry, and that's annoying, but I'm going to keep trying to talk here. Those plans are going to be, if implemented, an environmental catastrophe, an ecological disaster on the likes that we haven't seen possibly ever, or at least since the great exploitation of resources that began with the Industrial Revolution. And so what I'm talking about is the amount of land that it's going to require to go fully renewable, to go to solar, and to go to wind, which is what we're really talking about here. Because nuclear power is explicitly excluded from this. They don't want nuclear power, which is insane, because nuclear is reliable, nuclear is clean, non-pollutant as far as emissions. Nuclear has a lower carbon footprint than both wind and solar when you take all things into consideration, which you have to if you're talking about the actual carbon footprint, because you have to mine materials to create solar panels and windmills, and you have to build them, and they right now they currently have a 20-year life expectancy, far shorter than a nuclear plant's life expectancy. So they're not more environmentally friendly than nuclear. So you got to be objective. The fact that nuclear is specifically being excluded tells you that this is not completely about the environment and not completely about the climate. There are other things that this is about. If it wasn't, nuclear would be the way we would be moving. That's the most practical. That's a pragmatic solution. You want clean power? Nuclear. You want lower carbon emissions? Lower carbon footprint? Nuclear is the lowest. You want reliable energy? There you go. Right? And I'm not a big advocate for nuclear. I'm not a shill for the nuclear industry. I was actually opposed to nuclear for a long time because I worry about the potential for a Chernobyl or a Fukushima type event. And of course I've been insured many times by people within the industry that that's not going to happen in the United States because of our safety regulations and the way we run things and the way we do things. Well, I'm not 100% sure on that either. I wish there was another way to go besides nuclear. I live basically in the shadow of a nuclear plant. I grew up right under the 9 Mile plant. You know, I was a mile away from it. I don't particularly care for seeing them on the landscape either. But as far as practicality and as far as combating pollution, which I do think is a very worthwhile cause, and I am in favor of phasing out coal and that sort of thing. You know, it's old and outdated technology. Why wouldn't we start phasing it out? But I'm not in favor of destroying our energy security and destroying the environment at the same time. And that's exactly what we would be doing with these giant solar farms and these industrial wind turbines. So it's about the amount of land that it requires to be industrialized in order to turn our grid completely renewable, which is not green by any stretch of the imagination. It's actually laughable that they would say that. So by one study at least, it will require 25% to 50%, that's 25% to 50% of all land within the United States for us to go 100% renewable. 25% to 50%. That is an environmental disaster. That is massive industrialization. That's a dystopian hellscape. That's what that is. That is not green. Think of the road building involved with the turbines, you know. Think of the land clearing involved with the solar panels. Now in the West, a lot of this can be done in the desert, and you can make the argument, well, it's just desert. Who cares? You know, it has no ecological value. I would probably disagree with you on that, but you can make that case that we can put a lot of stuff in the desert. We can put a lot of stuff on the plains, which are the plains, so who cares about them? But maybe we should, you know. But anyways, in the East, we're looking at a very different situation. We're looking at putting the solar panels and the wind farms, and this will require millions and millions and millions of acres of land. We're looking at putting them on agricultural land and forest land. There's nowhere else to put it. You know, we're not going to bulldoze cities. It's going to go onto agricultural land, which is going to weaken our food security, which is a terrible idea. Or it's going to go on forest land, and we're going to be clearing, you know, the large forest of the East, which is a terrible idea. Terrible for biodiversity, terrible for water quality, terrible for the general health of the environment. It's just, there was no forward thinking on this. It's just reactionary. These are terrible policies, and these are policies. I mean, this is law. Now people are going to push back. You know, once you see millions of acres start getting converted into you know, gigantic wind turbines and endless fields of solar panels, people are going to start pushing back against it. Long before they reach their goals, we're going to start seeing systemic failures of the grid, like we've seen in Texas, which is partly because of this and partly because of other things, as I expressed. But we're going to start seeing those things happen more and more often because the cold isn't going anywhere. This is a fantasy that you know, the Earth is going to keep warming to such a degree that we don't have winter anymore and the cold waves are going to go away and all that. And that's ridiculous. That's not what happened. It's not what's happening. It's not what we're observing. It's not what appears to be likely in the future. Cold waves have actually gotten stronger since 2014. And I'll touch on that in a minute, I'm sure. But yeah, so we see big problems with this, and these problems are going to manifest when demand is highest. And now looking at the other side, looking at, like, say, so it's not just cold waves. You also have big power issues with heat waves. You know, historically we've had rolling blackouts and big heat waves, and you know, there's a lot more demand on electricity then because people are using air conditioning, and extreme heat's life-threatening too. You can die from heat stroke, but it's much less dangerous than cold, much less likely. There's tons of studies on the amount of people cold kills versus heat. It's astronomically more for cold. Cold is much more dangerous. Now we're looking at a disaster in Texas. Texas is a pretty warm place. They're not going to stay cold for more than a week or two, really. And they're going to warm back up, and they're going to get back to normal. You take Montana, you take the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, northern Michigan, northern New York, Maine, and you put this sort of scenario there, well, the power demand's not going to go away if this happens during a bad winter, during a, you know, period of strong atmospheric blocking that's keeping a trough over us for a month or two at a time. The demand's going to keep getting worse. The situation's going to keep getting worse, and you're going to have much more serious consequences, even than what we're seeing in Texas, where they're ill-prepared for this sort of thing. And most of what's happening in Texas is to do with the cold, not necessarily the snow and ice, right? So the snow, there wasn't a whole lot of snow in the storm. What was spectacular about it is the amount of area that snow covered. I mean, snow right down to sea level at Galveston. That's pretty impressive. But the snow itself wasn't very impressive. Texas gets bigger snowstorms than that, particularly in the north. It's unusual for it to be most of the state. Ice storms, the ice storm obviously did some damage to the power grid. It wasn't an extreme ice storm. Texas has had much worse ice storms. Ice storms get a whole lot worse than that. That did add to the problem, but the main problem was the cold and the demand for power and the inability to supply the demand for power. Now looking at another place that is having systemic failure of their power grid, we have California. California, and this is mostly the fault of PG&E Electric, and the regulators, the state regulators in California. So PG&E has, they have an aging grid. The grid's getting too old, and they have a lot of problems with it, and they haven't been updating it, they haven't been investing in it, they haven't been putting the money in it, and they haven't been being forced to. So they actually recently, a while ago, they gave billions of dollars in bonuses to their top people, didn't invest in the infrastructure. Oh, I'll go back, I forget the date, but it was a few years ago, I think. There was a big wildfire. It was determined to be caused by PG&E's equipment. They were sued. They were held responsible for the fire. So PG&E's response to this hasn't really been updating the grid or fixing the problems. It's been, we'll just shut the electricity off during fire weather. When it's really hot and generally windy with the type of patterns they get there on the Pacific coast. So it's that's their answer. We'll just kill the power, and of course that creates problems, right? You don't want to just kill the power when it's real hot and people need their air conditioners, and I mean people need power for other things too than staying comfortable. So that's a bad example. And just to show you how ridiculous this is, so the reason these are dangerous during fire weather is because the high winds. They cause the lines to sway, and they spark, and they arc, and they send off sparks, and it starts fires. Well, this is the year 2021, and we haven't addressed this. Now you go back to the early 1900s, beginning of the 20th century, and the state was forcing the railroads to put spark arresters onto the smokestacks of their locomotives. Like, particularly, see in New York, we had the big Adirondack fire of 1903, and this was caused because of drought, but exacerbated by sparks from trains. They helped light more fires. Well, the state mobilized to prevent this sort of thing from happening, and it didn't really work because it was compliance was limited, and it wasn't very easy to enforce back then. They really didn't have the resources to enforce it, but they made an attempt, and it seems to be more of an attempt than what's being made in 2021 in California with PG&E's grid, and they're not wanting to take responsibility for it because of the financial obligations and for their mismanaging money in the past. So again, sort of a general systemic failure that we're starting to see in California. But the policies that we have in New York and across the country, and just the way that everything is moving, is as we start implementing these policies more and more, they're going to exacerbate this problem exponentially. I think it's going to get a lot worse, and you're going to see pushback against it, and probably start moving away from those ideas. Now, I do believe wind and solar have their place. I think it's great to put solar panels on existing infrastructure like houses and buildings. Wind turbines too, on top of tall buildings, not the big industrial ones you see on top of the hills, but they actually have housing that they build around a circular turbine, and they can put them on top of tall buildings, and that's fine. Is it going to solve our energy problems? Not at all. Not even remotely. It will supplement power. You'll have clean power that's supplementing the grid, and you won't be destroying millions of acres of land to do so. It makes sense, right? Add that along with nuclear. Further the research in geothermal. There's a lot of potential there, I think, that we haven't figured out yet. We aren't there yet, but there's a lot of potential in geothermal. There's probably a lot of potential with tidal generators. Those are very interesting ways to do renewable energy. But in the meantime, we have a solution, and it doesn't even have to be a permanent solution. It can be a temporary solution, and nuclear can be phased out later. And I don't see why we're destroying our energy security, and eventually we'll destroy our environment over, well, a lot of superstitions, really. This stuff isn't particularly science-based in general. We're not going to all die, regardless of what the Guardian or Volks tells you. Probably not going to all die within the next 18 months or 11 years from catastrophic global heating. More pressing at the moment is people freezing to death in their houses in Texas, right? So, anyways, on that, on the cold waves, right? Why are cold waves getting stronger as the Earth is getting warmer during the modern warming period? Well, they'll probably tell you that it's because of global warming and give you some crappy explanation for it, but that's nonsense. So, before I get into that, a criteria for the validity of a scientific hypothesis is widely been considered the accuracy of its predictions. Anthropogenic global warming hypothesis, global warming theory, that's the predictions have failed abysmally. They've been wrong almost across the board, since its inception. So to fix this problem, what people, particularly the media too, this isn't all just criticism of the science, although I do have some criticism of, I do have plenty of criticism for the scientific community, but the media has really, pushed this where they'll find somebody who makes an apology for these weather events that aren't supposed to be happening, and then says, well, global warming's the reason. We should expect this, even though the original prediction said the exact opposite would happen. So now any trend is being caused by global warming, no matter how contradictory. Any weather event, no matter whether they were more extreme in the past or more common in the past or not, is caused by global warming. And the other weather events that don't jive with it, that take the opposite type of patterns to form, are also caused by global warming. So everything bad is caused by global warming. It's also the reason for the pandemic, if you can believe that. And it's also the reason, I'm not exaggerating, this is peer-reviewed papers, it's also the reason that aliens haven't contacted us, because we've caused global warming. Look it up, read the papers. This is what it is. So anyways, what's actually going on? Why are cold waves getting stronger, have been getting stronger in the northern hemisphere, North America particularly, since about 2014? Well, back in the 1970s, we identified that Meridiano Flow, which is the wavy jet stream, becomes more common during periods of low solar activity, extended periods of low solar activity. Now, we always have Meridiano Flow and zonal flow. Zonal flow is when the jet stream goes more or less straight. Meridiano Flow is when it's wavy like this. That's always a normal part of the climate. It's always a normal part of the weather. But when you get into periods of extended low solar activity, Meridiano Flow becomes more frequent and more amplified. This means stronger cold waves and stronger heat waves too, for that matter. And it means that more extreme weather, in the sense that you have blocking patterns get established longer, and so you can get stuck into a cold pattern, wet pattern, hot pattern, dry pattern for longer periods of time than you normally would, and that wouldn't happen to that degree under a zonal flow. So the more Meridiano flow you get, the more extreme cold waves you're going to get, and also there's going to be more heat waves, particularly in the summer. Now, why aren't the heat waves as bad as the cold waves, historically speaking? And they are not. Now, heat wave magnitude has decreased greatly through the modern warming. because it's not getting hotter, it's getting warmer, and there was a very big difference in that. And most of the warming is occurring at night. And these are minor amounts, pretty minor amounts that we're talking about too. You know, a degree over 150 years, and that's probably exaggerated quite a bit because of bad data homogenization, and because they haven't adequately taken into account the urban heat island effect. But that's a tangent I'm not trying to go on. So anyways, the reason the heat waves haven't been as extreme as they were, like say in the Dust Bowl years, when they were, I mean, almost unimaginable by today's standards. You go into the Dust Bowl years and look at the heat waves back then, particularly in 1936, and it's mind-blowing. It's astounding how hot it was on the plains, and how long these heat waves continued, and how far north they went, and we exacerbated this a little bit with the Dust Bowl, with our agricultural practices, but we didn't create it. We didn't create those conditions. They happened because of pan-continental drought. Pan-continental drought creates greater heat waves and greater heat wave magnitude, and pan-continental drought has been on the decline because, broadly speaking, the world is getting wetter. This is why the Meridiano Flow does produce strong heat waves and record heat, but it hasn't been of the epic historic proportions that we've seen in the 1930s. And even in the 1800s, late 1800s, the data's not as good, but there's a lot of evidence of it. So anyways, this particular cold wave, it appears to be, well, I don't want to say it's the worst cold wave in Texas since 1899, but it may be, and it's on par with the worst anyway. It's been about 1899 since we can reliably say we've seen something this scope, this scale, over the southern plains, this bad. And so it's been a long time, much longer than, I think this is probably worse than any within living memory. I could be wrong on that. I haven't gone through all the analogs and looked at that, but it's whatever. It's a fairly historic proportions, if not unprecedented, but fairly historic proportions. And so you look at the 1899 Arctic outbreak, and a lot of what was just generally happening across the United States and North America in like the 19 teens. There was a lot of very cold winters, and this well, we were seeing more Meridiano Flow then, and this occurred during a period called the Centennial Minimum, the Gleisberg Minimum, which was a period of not really low solar activity, but lower solar activity. It was a dip in solar activity for an extended period of time. And we've seen a lot more Meridiano Flow and a lot more of these Arctic outbreaks during this period. And we're starting to see that now as you know, solar activity has been declining over the last few solar cycles, and this is also why I think this will continue, with the caveat that we can't predict the future, and you know, the prediction of solar cycles and all that is in its infancy. It appears that for the next 30 years or so, we are likely to continue seeing a decline in solar activity, which should create a greater frequency of high amplitude Meridiano Flow, so more of these extreme cold outbreaks, which are getting more and more common, like the one we seen last fall, like in the West, with the record snows and cold in September, like the one we seen in the spring before that, with record snows and cold for out of season, and obviously I could go right back to 2014 with a whole list of them, even during the warm years, not just the cold years or colder periods, but these are occurring during the warmer years too. So it doesn't appear that this is going to end anytime soon, and it's, well, coming at a bad point in history with these terrible energy policies. And hopefully this is somewhat of a wake-up call to the nation, but it won't be. So that is as it is, right? So anyways, just going back to the solar panels and the wind farms. You know what, before I do that, I said I wasn't going to go on tangents. Right, so broadly speaking, we're getting more cold waves, I believe, because of increased meridiano flow, because of declining solar activity. And specifically, this particular Arctic outbreak was caused by a sudden stratospheric warming. And these happen about once every 2 years on average. They're not unusual, but this was a particularly strong one. And sudden stratospheric warmings disrupt the jet stream. They cause sections of the polar vortex to break off and move south, and you get anomalous cold. And so, of course, that's going to be blamed on global warming, but there's an inverse relationship between the stratosphere and the troposphere, where we live, for temperature. And when it gets warmer in the troposphere, it gets colder in the stratosphere, which is why during the modern warm period, the stratosphere has overall cooled. But these sudden stratospheric warmings are a normal part of climate. They're infrequent, and this particular one appears to have been caused by a pair of record pressure anomalies that happened at the end of December and the beginning of January. So December 29th, 2020, there was a world record high pressure set over Mongolia. And this is extreme cold. I mean, this is an area that's accustomed to these Siberian highs and extreme cold. This is a normal part of their climate, but this was exceptional. This was world record high pressure. Temperatures dropped to 50 below zero Fahrenheit, and this pressure disruption ended up causing a record low pressure disruption shortly after in the North Pacific, which was the lowest non-tropical cyclone or non-extratropical cyclone. I forget the exact record, but it was the lowest pressure not related to a hurricane in the North Pacific on record within that region. So there was a record high pressure, record low pressure. You got to focus on the record high pressure because that's what influenced the next one. That's really what set off the sudden stratospheric warming. The chain of events that caused it was that record high pressure. That record high pressure caused record cold, not record warm. So tying it to CO2 into global warming is nonsense. Not that the Earth hasn't warmed, it has, but that's not what is causing these things. And saying so is being disingenuous. And it's just an excuse to keep the broader narrative going. So we got to look at the weather events honestly too, right? And we're not doing that. But anyways, so just back to the I didn't cover one little. I only have a few things on my notes and I skipped them. I mean, these are my notes and I skipped them. But anyways, so the 25 to 50% of all land mass in the United States being required to go 100% renewable. That comes from a 2015 study. It's a Power Density, a Key to Understanding Energy Sources and Uses by Vaclav Smil. That his work, his book. That's where that claim comes to. And whether that's exactly correct or not, we don't need to get in the weeds of that. It's not important. What is important is it will require massive amounts of land, millions and millions and millions and millions of acres to meet these agendas. And that will be an ecological disaster. Right? So I'm going to give you some quick numbers that this is just some math I ran through in a minute. This, you don't have to take this as a study because it isn't exact, but it just gives you a rough idea, right? So in Cayuga County, there's a planned solar farm that's going to require a 2,000 acre footprint. That's the entire land used up by the farm. Obviously, that's not every piece of grass on that land, but that's the footprint. 2,000 acre footprint for this solar farm. It will create enough power for 30,000 homes when it's not covered in snow. Now, near me on 9 Mile Point, there's a 900 acre footprint that has 3 nuclear reactors on it. Those 3 nuclear reactors on 900 acres, they produce enough power for 2.8 million homes. So if we just make a comparison by the size of the footprint for a nuclear site compared to a solar site, it would require To equal the 900 acre site, 9 Mile, it would require 187,000 acres of solar panels, 187,000 acres of industrial land use compared to 900 acres of industrial land use to equal the same amount of power. Tell me that's green and tell me that's sustainable. Come on, man. Come on, man. Right? It's not. So it's not a good idea. Again, put them on houses. Put them on existing infrastructure. Put them on buildings. Let's focus on nuclear. Let's not exclude nuclear. That's insane. Look at geothermal. Look at tidal generators. Look at other options. I better end this or I'm just going to keep talking. But yeah, that's it.